Well, thank you, everyone. Great to see so many active participants here today. Quite looking forward to our discussion. My name is Wayne Caldwell, and I'll be serving as our facilitator for the day, for the morning. I'm not going to keep you past noon as our target time to be concluded. And just great to see how much interest there is in this topic and the attendance that we have. We have over 100 registrants, and I see we're at 83 now, and I see other people continuing to come in. So again, we very much look forward to sharing some of the research results with you that have occurred through the work that's been ongoing, and looking forward to your input and discussion in the second hour of our session today as well. So I will invite people for the first hour, perhaps to turn off your camera just to protect bandwidth, which will hopefully help those people who have lesser quality internet. And I think that will serve us well, and also to keep your system on mute, again, for that first chunk of time as well. I see people are actively using the chat function. That's great. Please introduce yourself. And if you have observations or reflections as the morning goes along, again, feel free to input those into the chat box. I want to thank a number of people right at the outset. I want to thank Patricia Collins, who's the leader of this project, the primary researcher, and has done a great job keeping all of the researchers coordinated and leading to some good outcomes and good results as well. I want to thank Regan Zink, who's helped organize today in terms of all of those technical things that would have left me, quite frankly, bamboozled. So thank you for that, Regan. And also to thank Jennifer and Jack, and we'll thank them again momentarily for their willingness to volunteer their time to provide a presentation today that I think people will find to be helpful as well. It's also to acknowledge that this topic at times has been contentious in communities. It's a point of conflict for people, and I think we understand why. I've had those reflections in my own community watching a school closure happen. But today is about thinking about things positively, trying to think through what can we do better into the future? What can we learn from the research results that have been put together? And with that in mind, I encourage people to listen to other people, to be patient, because again, we've got a lot of people online, and to be patient and provide other folks with a chance to make their comments, to be thoughtful, to be non-judgmental, because people may have different points of view than we do, or that you do, or that I do. And of course, as part of that, to be our best selves. So we'll provide that opportunity again as we get into our discussion to remind us of those guidelines, if you like, for how we conduct our meeting today. So again, as just to reiterate, in the first hour, there are going to be some presentations coming towards you, and but with some opportunity for input through Slido and other techniques that we will be using as well. And then in the second hour, we'll be going into some small group discussions, and then coming back with a plenary discussion with all of us again with that opportunity to contribute. So with that, I'll invite Regan to advance the slide. And of course, it's so important that we be thinking about reconciliation and land acknowledgements. And this one is written from the perspective of the institution at the University of Guelph, but that the University of Guelph resides on the ancestral lands of the Attawandaron people and the treaty lands and territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. We uphold the significance of the dish with one spoon covenant and the continuing relationship our Indigenous neighbors have with this land. We recognize that today this gathering place is home to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, and acknowledging them reminds us of our relationship to this land where we learn and work. And I think it's so important that we do this from an institutional perspective, but I also think it's important that we be thinking about this in a personal, individual perspective as well. And with that in mind, I'd like to tell you a little bit about my story. My ancestors came to this country as settlers in the 1830s, initially settling outside of Guelph, and then going to the next image, purchasing farmland in Huron County in the 1870s, where my family has been throughout. And I was raised on a farm that my grandfather purchased in 1905. And the reason why I reflect on this is I suspect my ancestors didn't give any consideration to the land that they were on from the point of view of who had owned it previously, who were the owners of it, the Indigenous folks who resided in these lands. I know as a planner working with the County of Huron through the 1980s and the 1990s, Indigenous issues, reconciliation was not really on the table whatsoever. Next image, please. But as we move forward, I think it's really quite important, and this is where I reside today, the farm that my daughter owns, and we live here, the reforestation that we've done, but that in my own personal journey, that I do the best that I can, and this is my invitation to all of us, to do the best that we can to understand the relationships that occur and the need for us to try to make better decisions, ask the right questions, and do our own best to contribute to reconciliation. And I think by doing that, acknowledging Indigenous peoples reminds us of our important connection and responsibility to this and all of our relations. So let's keep that in mind in our discussions today. So the purpose of the meeting is, again, the sharing of information, applying this information to your context, again, providing you with that opportunity to contribute and gaining your perspective and key inputs to inform future decisions about school closures. This is a 5-year project. We'll hear lots of good detail from Patricia in a few moments on it. But again, it's that opportunity to share information and to allow you to reflect on that information and offer us your input. So the agenda, I've sort of covered that already, but we're going to have 2 presentations from Jack Amendolia and Jennifer Passy. We'll have a little Slido in there after that, and then a more detailed presentation from Patricia, looking at some of the research findings, and then 2 opportunities for group discussion. The first one in small group discussion, and then we'll come back and we'll debrief those results in a broader format, and we'll provide you with those instructions in a few moments. So just again to acknowledge the research team, and I think many of these folks are on the call today, and also thank the graduate students who have contributed, but Patricia from Queens as the principal investigator, Mark Seasons and Jennifer Dean from Waterloo, myself from Guelph, Bill Irwin from Western, and Jeff Masuda from Victoria. So this is our first opportunity for a little bit of input. This is a Slido, and I'm hoping most people are familiar with this technique. What you want to do is scan that barcode. We're going to give you a moment to do that, or you can go to slido.com. But the easiest thing is just to scan the barcode and then respond to the question in terms of which stakeholder group are you a part of. If you are part of more than one group, select the one that you most closely identify with. And I see we're starting to get some results come in, so we'll just take a moment and let people provide their input. Maybe, Regan, you can give me a sign when the input seemed to have stopped as far as you can monitor. So again, you have the opportunity to respond as a school board staff, municipal staff, or council members, another category, the research community, school board trustees, and provincial staff as well. And I think we've advanced the slides inadvertently there. There we go. We're back to the school board staff coming at us. I see we have 46 respondents, so half of you have now responded. Just a few more seconds. But as we can see there, the majority of folks with us, or I guess about a little over half, are with the school boards, and a good contingent of municipal staff and council members, some folks from other categories, and a few researchers, school board trustees, and so on. So thank you for those results. I think, Regan, we can go to the next slide. Again, this is a chance just to let everyone know what region you're from. And we have, again, going to the code there in the bottom, the QR code. And in addition to that, a chance to indicate whether you're from the GTA, Eastern Ontario, Southwestern Ontario, Central, or Northern. And looks like we've got lots of participants from the GTA and Southwestern Ontario and Eastern Ontario. Given the population size from the north, great to see as many participants as we have there, and from Central Ontario as well, which is sort of that band around the GTA, or however you might self-identify. So that's great to see again, and it's really helpful for us as researchers to see the distribution from across the province and the range to which the research has got out there in terms of being of interest to different people from different spots. So again, thanks to those people who responded, and we'll go to the next slide. So we're going to get into the process of starting to share information, but at the outset, we thought it really important to have a background from people who work intensely with the issue as practitioners. And Jack Amendolia will be our first presenter, and he's a managing partner and leads the school board accommodation planning practice at Watson & Associates, lots of experience, over 20 years with extensive experience in school board planning, educational development charges, and enrollment forecasting. Those items which are really key in thinking through this issue. He's worked for school boards, federal agencies, social services agencies, and First Nations communities throughout the country. Now, once Jack has completed his presentation, then we'll hear from Jennifer Passy. And Jennifer is a registered professional planner in Ontario with over 24 years of experience, including school boards and land development. Currently the manager of planning for the Waterloo Catholic District School Board, and she's involved in Lakers local stakeholder committees and provincial working groups representing the Waterloo Catholic District School Board and the broader school board administrative sector. So again, a very helpful perspective that we'll look forward to hearing from Jennifer as well. But with that, I'll go to the next slide and turn it over to Jack and say thank you again, Jack.
Good morning, everybody. Thanks, Wayne. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. Just to reiterate what Wayne said, really nice to see such a diverse crowd this morning for such an interesting and what can be a complex topic. So I've personally been a part of many accommodation reviews throughout the province. My firm has worked on many accommodation plans for school boards where consolidations or closures are a part of the recommendations. So today I want to talk a little bit about why we think, school boards consider closures of schools. And I think it's important to kind of start at the planning stage. Typically, a recommendation to consolidate or close a school doesn't happen in a silo or it doesn't happen in isolation. It's typically part of a more holistic accommodation planning exercise. So if we go to the next slide, we think about what's accommodation planning in the school board world. And the way I like to describe it is when you think about school board planning or accommodation planning, school boards have these very large fixed assets, schools. The majority of these assets and schools were built to service population and immigration patterns that largely developed post-World War II, that were largely a reaction to the baby boom. And we'll look at this in a little more detail in a second. But how do you plan with these large assets that were built to this population or migration that happened 50, 60, 70 years ago with these assets that we can't really move, right? So that is really when we talk about school board accommodation planning, it's trying to figure out how to deal with those changing populations, changing migration patterns with these fixed assets. Then we have to layer on enrollment and facility condition, community needs, programs, student achievement, board initiatives, policies, ministry initiatives. So we can see quite quickly that this becomes a very complex matter and complex issue. So that's part one is it comes out of this accommodation planning. The second part that I want to talk about is how did we get here? And that's kind of what I talked about at the very beginning in terms of these changing immigration patterns and changing population patterns. So if we advance to the next slide, and I've used these next two slides that we're going to look at probably thousands of times in my 20 years in presentations, because they're really relevant to understand the background and the context as to why we are in sort of the population scenario we are in Canada. So the slide that we're looking at here is showing two things. The solid black line is total fertility rate in Canada from the 1920s to the 2000s. And then the purple dashed line is the actual total number of births. So if we go back to the pre-World War II, population was lower. So obviously the total number of births were lower, but fertility rates were high. And this is, again, pre-World War II, definitely more of an agricultural environment still, larger families. Fast forward to post-World War II, prosperous times after the war, economy is starting to roll again, lots and lots of immigration from Europe coming into Canada. So all of a sudden, population starts to increase, births really start to increase as well, and fertility rates remain high at that point. So it's the combination of perfect storm in terms of population increase. But then fast forward to the 1970s, and there's a lot of good things that resulted in this, a couple of bad things, but really in the 70s, things changed in terms of household formation. And we can see, births they dropped from the 60s to the 70s from that peak, but births still remain somewhat high, but it's really that total fertility rate that really fell off a cliff in the 1970s. Why? Some of it economic, energy crisis, big energy crisis in the 70s, led to, again, that less need, or obviously because of the economic changes, you had smaller families, less children to support. Suburbanization was happening during that time as well. But some of the good things that resulted in this lower fertility rate really had to do with gender equality. Post 60s and 70s, a lot more women in college, a lot more women in the workforce. As a result, women are having children later in life and having overall less children. So that's really the environment that we found ourselves in throughout the 2000s, is smaller household sizes, smaller families, less children, dropping fertility rates, and obviously resulting in a smaller school age population. If we advance to the next slide, this slide gives us a better idea of what happened in Ontario during part of that time. So as we sort of, see fertility rates dropping and births dropping in Canada, obviously Ontario kind of driving the bus in terms of Canadian population growth for a long time. Same thing happening in Ontario. So what we're looking at here is a total number of births in Ontario in the early 1990s, over 150,000, dropped drastically down to about 127,000 by the year 2000. So in a 10-year span, a really significant drop in births. Post 2000, obviously that has a big impact on the school age population and thus enrollment. Post 2000, we kind of hit the bottom of the trough and started to pick up, and births increased back to sort of that 140,000 range by about 2008. And as demographers at school age demographer at that time, we expected that increase to be pretty sustainable and pretty continued. But again, to get an idea of how things are impacted by external factors, and we'll talk about this quickly a little bit more in a couple of minutes, is in 2008, we had a big economic crisis again, a big housing crisis globally. And that really impacted immigration, which is a huge driver of growth in Canada, and again, impacted births in Ontario as well. And they've been really flat since 2008. So the population and the school age population has remained somewhat flat as well. And then 2020, drop again. Why? COVID. Obviously, big drop in immigration. Also, people were just having less births in general during that time, as there was uncertainty over the health world. So we can see that, this is kind of what has led to this less school age population. And as a result, putting school boards in certain positions to consider certain accommodation decisions. So that's a big driver. But if we look at the next slide, there are other things that we want to consider. And I think Jen may get into, obviously the pupil accommodation guidelines or lack thereof right now. But some of this is prescribed, right, in terms of what school boards need to look at to determine whether they should look at a consolidation. But really, I just wanted to highlight a couple of things quickly on this slide. Obviously, demographics and enrollment trends. We just talked about sort of what the drivers were and why we find ourselves in kind of the demographic situation we find ourselves. But like I touched on at the beginning, there are other things that have to be considered when we're thinking about making recommendations for consolidation. I talked about the facility itself. We have to consider long-term growth prospects of possible redevelopment or regeneration in neighborhoods. We have to think about transportation. We can't make kids get on buses for 2 hours. We have to think about community wants and needs and the engagement we get from them. Ministry policies obviously have a big role in dictating how school boards accommodate their students. And then the last one is probably the biggest one. And again, we could probably do a whole day of presentations just on the funding models. But I think I'd be remiss if we didn't talk about the impact that funding has when considering whether to consolidate or not. It's probably as important as the other bullet points on this slide, because we do have a funding model that basically incentivizes rationalizing space. If you want to build space, you typically have to rationalize every possible space that you have before you're going to get ministry funding. Even the education development charge to secure new land really has an angle that you have to use surplus spaces first. And the more surplus space you have, the less likelihood you're going to be able to secure future land. So that's a big part of the considerations outside of some of the demographics and facility condition considerations that go into school accommodation consolidation recommendations. Last couple of slides I want to highlight are just, we talked about, how we got ourselves in, or not we got ourselves in this situation, but how we found ourselves in this demographic situation. A lot of it was, sort of the aging of the baby boom population. I want to highlight that, we're in another period of significant change now. What has happened over the last 5 years, I think, can be compared to everything I talked about with regard to the baby boom and the aging of the population. There have been some significant shifts, both demographically, migration-wise. A large part of this was housing affordability and migration moving out of the GTA. The global pandemic, COVID, really exacerbated that, changed how we work and how we live and the type of space that we want. So it really remains to be seen, I think, over the next several years, what this means in terms of school age populations and enrollment for school boards and how they're going to react to some of these changes. So again, just wanted to highlight that. And maybe the last slide before I finish off, just again to sort of put this on the radar too, that it's not just it's important to differentiate, and I think we will today, about a rural and an urban consolidation. And what I'm showing you here is just some demographics for a really new neighborhood in Southern Ontario. And you can see sort of in 2001 to 2006, just extreme population growth, like 250, almost 300% in some cohorts. And that, stabilized a little bit, but still a huge growth really from 2001 to 2016. But if you look at the two red circles on there, what I've highlighted there is the preschool age population trends, just to show you how quickly things change nowadays. So in a community that had extreme growth, lots of new schools built, you can see that elementary school age population increased by 6, 7, 8,000 over a 10, 15-year period. The 0 to 3 population is starting to drop drastically by 15%, 2011 to 16, and 27% in the last 5 years. So again, things are changing so rapidly, and now schools, even in this area, or boards have these brand new schools built to service this peak. What do we do in 10, 15, 20 years when all of a sudden these populations could be 3/4 or half of what they were 10 or 15 years ago? So I'll stop there. I hope I provided a little bit of perspective on kind of the demographic challenges that school boards are facing, sort of why we got to this demographic situation we're in, and just to make everyone aware that, the future definitely holds some other challenges in terms of demographics and trying to react to it from a school board perspective. So thanks very much for your attention.
That's great. Thanks very much, Jack. That was very clear, insightful, and helpful. So thanks again for that. And I'll now turn the screen over to Jen.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much, Wayne. So the section that is accompanying my name is Pupil Accommodation Review Process today. It could be a very short presentation given the pause or moratorium that we've had in place for the last 5 years, but I think it's helpful to know where this process started, how it's evolved over time with a view to improving how the process has been conducted, how the information's developed, and the experience of those who participate as stakeholders in review processes. Back to 1998, the education sector, like the broader municipal sector, experienced a radical shift when boards, like municipalities, were amalgamated across the province. And for boards, we also moved to a centralized funding model, which was intended to provide equity across the province. But due to the shift in funding, due to the amalgamation of boards, we found ourselves in situations where we needed to deal with surplus capacity, and that necessitated closing schools. Next slide. The first guidelines were introduced around 2006 and kind of have been the basis for the evolution over time for what we still have as a framework today. They came out of the province's Good Places to Learn initiative that wanted to provide what was the first fully structured pupil accommodation review guideline that would provide an opportunity to provide evaluation criteria for how boards would look at different schools and provide a more structured decision-making framework. The guidelines were released in October of 2006, and a key tenet was that boards needed to have their own policies in place within about 6 months, and those policies need to take into account the evaluation of the value of schools to students, such as their learning environment, outcomes, range of course or program offerings, the value to the community, including broader community use of facilities, school grounds, recreational use, and partners and other initiatives. The value to the board itself with regards to looking at program offerings, the kind of teaching spaces, the condition, and as Jack talked about, the location of the school and meeting the needs of the changing demographics. There's also an element of the value to the local economy. And this has been one that has been sort of reviewed and altered over time. And that was looking at the school as an employer, the availability of co-op jobs, perhaps, if we're talking about secondary school students, training opportunities, partnerships, and how businesses may be affected by school closures. A key tenet of those guidelines was also the formation of an accommodation review committee, which was to be made up by parents, educators, board officials, and business and municipal leaders. And those last two, depending on the community, depending on the process, have been more challenging to find. They're difficult positions for community members or municipal staff to find themselves in, and they have again changed over time as well. The processes were lengthy and could be expected to take a minimum of 7 months to complete, which is a huge commitment to any public member to be participating in an accommodation review. As I said, those 2006 guidelines kind of created the basis for the guidelines that we have today, but they've changed over time. Next slide. Each time the PARG was reviewed, it was an attempt to reflect on what worked, what didn't, and improve the process and outcomes. In 2009, a more streamlined process was brought into place with modifications of the terms of reference for accommodation review committees, that's the ARC acronym there, and the modified valuation tool. Some of the timelines changed. There was stronger references to long-term enrollment and capital planning, including the introduction of language and actions tied to community planning and partnerships. And there was the modified valuation tool looked to provide more continuity and consistency in how boards were undertaking that evaluation. Those guidelines also improved the clarity around the ARC's role and the decision-making, as well as the role of the Board of Trustees. Between 2009 and 2015, the ministry and school boards had received a lot of feedback about the effectiveness of the guideline and how it impacted all stakeholders. There were concerns about the contentiousness of the processes, the apparent one-size-fits-all approach, and the length of the process. So in early 2014, the ministry established a capital advisory committee, which was comprised of 15 school board representatives from all over the province, east to west, north to south. And they were tasked with reviewing the pupil accommodation review guideline and making recommendations around changes. There were consultations as a result of those recommendations in late 2014 and early 2015, and a new guideline was released in 2015. That new guideline, again, looked to provide efficiencies in streamlining the process for the benefit of all, because again, as I mentioned, the longer the process, the harder it is on everybody involved. The new process invited municipalities and community partners to meet with and comment on recommendations much earlier, and so that boards are able to take into account any additional information as early in the process as possible, including where there might be other interests that were not previously known to boards. There was enhancements in documentation and in efforts to engage the partners. The valuation was refocused on student well-being, academic achievement, and board financial viability and sustainability. There was also an introduction of transition planning to ensure that the community understood fully and there was a documented plan for how changes affected by a process were to be put in place. There was also standards introduced that would allow boards to adopt modified processes in order to reflect, again, the unique nature and differences of how processes affect communities across the province. Again, in 2017 and 2018, the province opened up the opportunity to consult broadly on further changes to the review guidelines. There was a renewed focus on the community hub infrastructure at that time and the supports for rural and northern schools. The new draft guideline introduced essentially opportunity to consider urban and rural schools differently, such that the economic impact assessment was introduced where there was a rural or northern financially supported school involved, but wasn't necessarily a component of a urban pupil accommodation review process. But back to the very first statement in terms of the process today, those 2018 guidelines were released, but without supporting information. And so we sit and have sat since 2018 with a pause in place, and boards are unable at this time to pursue any school closure processes. Next slide. So what we know is that nothing has changed with regards to, nothing substantive has changed with regards to funding. Jack has touched on those pandemic shifts in enrollment. The mobility of our population has significantly changed. Those who may follow a noted demographer or economist in Ontario, Mike Moffat, may have been hearing that drive to qualify terminology over the last 3 years. We've seen an exodus of school-age children from Toronto and the GTA. In order for families to find housing that was more affordable to them, those families have taken those school-age children further and further afield. Further immigration has added pressures to some of our communities and has shifted where our population is settling. We have areas across the province who would have historically been potentially faced with surplus pupil places in their schools prior to the pandemic. And those schools may now be full, but that just means, again, a shift of that population elsewhere in the province keeps pressure on boards to continue to respond to those changes and consider whether there is the need to provide more efficient use of those fixed built assets that Jack referred to. Thanks, Reagan.
Thanks very much, Jennifer. Great to have those perspectives and your hands on the ground experience with it. So thank you again. We're going to provide a chance again. I noticed there were a couple of people that weren't able to get into Slido previously, but I think it should be, again, good to go for you. Just scan that QR code, or if you're previously on Slido, open it up. And in 10 words or less, how have school closures affected your community? And we just want to hear some of your perspectives at this stage in terms of how it might be impacting things from your own understanding and from your own personal experience. So we should start to see some results there. And I'll just refer to a couple of them. Kids changed schools, township bought the old schools. That's an interesting outcome. And I know of that outcome happening in other communities as well, where the municipality has taken over a school. I see we've got 22 people typing at the moment. So long bus rides, and that's certainly a factor for some children. more equitable access to education, and some changes there in terms of larger schools and what they can offer. Refreshed rebuilds with good population, empty buildings in some instances, rural kids going to urban schools, and I know that in my own community to be a factor in some instances. Reduced school board trust, and I'm sure that's something that people want to address as best as they can. A loss of a sense of community, and I see them coming through here quickly, so just encourage people to watch and read. The longer commute again, larger schools with more programming and course options, some of the positive outcomes that can occur. Students relocated, challenges attracting young families to a community if there's no school there, as have been identified. Reuse opportunity for older schools. And again, I apologize because I can't keep up with all of them, but there's some great comments coming through there. School becoming a retirement home. Dissatisfaction within the community. Again, that focus on improved facilities for learning, which is a positive to hear about. More difficult to recruit employers in medical services. Constraint, threat of school closures impact people's choice to move to the area. Some mistrust issues happening. Intensification of rundown schools. These are all great comments. And I'll just reconfirm with Regan. I think people can continue to input here as we move forward. Can you confirm that for me, Regan? Or
no, this poll will close when I.
Okay, so we'll just give another couple of minutes then, just to let anyone who wants to input something here to do so. Again, medical facilities attracting doctors has been mentioned there. Looks like we're drawing to a close in terms of the number of people that are typing. So I'll just thank everyone for those helpful comments. And again, there will be a chance to reflect back on these as time goes by. And with that, I'm going to ask Regan to advance us to the next slide and turn it over to Dr. Patricia Collins, who will provide an overview of some of the research. And again, thanks for people that contributed in that last Slido poll.
Great, thanks so much, Wayne. Can you confirm you can hear me okay?
Full speed ahead, it's good. Okay,
fantastic. So thank you so much, everyone, for making yourselves available this morning to attend this session. And I'm really looking forward to hearing your feedback on this really important issue. I think the previous speakers have really helped to shine a light on just the complexity of this issue. And I think the research team has really discovered how enormously complex this issue is over the years. I think many times we've likened the school closure issue to an onion, and it seems like we're just constantly peeling back new layers. So my name is Patricia Collins. I'm an associate professor at Queen's University, which is situated on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. I'm a child of British and Irish settlers who immigrated to Canada in the 1970s. And I just feel I'm just so privileged to be able to call this region of Ontario home. So I'm going to be representing the research team today and the collective work that we've engaged in over the years, the past 5 years or so. And I will be providing an overview of some of our key findings. Next slide, please, Regan. And Wayne already introduced the other co-investigators on the team, the faculty members from different universities. But of course, this is a collective effort of a much larger group of other researchers, graduate research assistants and research coordinators who have contributed enormously to this project over the years, and many of whom are on the call today. So thank you so much to the research team for your collective efforts to make this happen. Next slide, please. So I'm a health geographer by training, and so I think a lot about the connections between health and place. And I define health quite broadly. I think a lot about well-being and livability in communities. And so I've always thought about the important role that schools play in creating complete communities. And within the field of urban planning, schools are certainly considered in many ways to be central to a complete community. In fact, this sort of thinking dates back to the work of Clarence Perry from the 1920s, where the neighborhood unit was really defined as having the school at the center of that unit. And that particular philosophy really informed the way that we built communities since the 1920s across North America, and has really contributed to this whole notion and perception that schools serve smaller communities and are at the heart of those communities. And I think that helps us to understand why people react so strongly to the loss of a school in their community. I think we're all very well aware of the various benefits that schools provide to communities beyond the educational programming that they are mandated to deliver. And these benefits range from physical infrastructure to support play and recreation for all the residents in the community, providing a space for socialization and social connection, provision of different kinds of amenities and services to the community, like childcare and public libraries. Often schools are the locations where important programming is provided in the community for populations in need. Things like meal programs and settlement services are often made available in school settings. Schools are also a really important part of our cultural heritage, and a lot of residents have very strong connection to place because of the school that's located in their community. And of course, schools can also help to support economic stability and growth, particularly in rural communities. And I think this emerged in a number of your responses to the previous question. Next slide, please. So, as we've already sort of talked about, there's been this growing a number of school closures since the early 2000s. And when our research team was gathering, one of the things that we were aware of was stories in the news media that suggested that closures were happening more often in more established communities, that is rural communities and inner city communities. So communities that have been around for a longer period of time than, say, newer suburban developments. And as a health geographer and having other members on the team that are health geographers, we raised some questions about whether there may be some implications of school closures for socio-spatial equity and environmental justice. And so that was one of the lenses that we applied to the study. Next slide, please. So I won't go into detail here. We got a lovely introduction from Jennifer on the pupil accommodation review guidelines that were previously used. And because they were such a source of intense critique from residents who were dealing with the outcome of school closures in their communities, these critiques obviously triggered the moratorium and this pause on closures so that the provincial government could figure out how the guidelines could be amended. Fortunately, as researchers, this moratorium also offered us an opportunity to study school closures in some depth, with the hope that we would be able to generate some evidence that could inform changes to the decision-making model. Next slide. So we actually had 4 study objectives, and if you read through the materials that we circulated in advance, you probably only saw 3 study objectives. So early on in the study, we realized that, we need another objective, which is to just understand what's happening province-wide in terms of the scope of school closures and the characteristics of communities where those schools have closed, as well as wanting to know a little bit more about what has happened with those closed school sites. So we added that objective as a first objective. And then the remaining objectives are reflected in that summary that you may have read. So the second was to verify the dynamics and shortcomings of existing PAR processes as employed by 2 school boards in Ontario. So these were obviously PAR processes that happened prior to the moratorium being implemented. The third was to expose the consequences of these processes and resulting school closures in selected communities in Ontario. And then fourth, to collectively interpret the implications of these processes and consequences and collaboratively conceive of an improved decision-making model. And this fourth objective is really why we're all gathered here today. And I'm hoping we can have a really productive conversation about these findings that will then inform a subsequent meeting that's scheduled for late November. So in terms of study design and site selection, we employed a mixed methods embedded comparative case study. So mixed methods just simply means that we used a combination of qualitative and quantitative methods. And we selected 2 school board districts in Ontario that had a combination of urban and rural kinds of communities. And we specifically chose those kinds of school board districts because of what we had been reading about in news media coverage of school closures, that closures were happening in these kinds of settings. And we selected one rural and one urban community in each district. So we had a total of 4 communities that we studied in depth, where closures had happened since 2016. And we wanted to look at communities where closures were a little bit more recent, so that residents could really reflect more accurately on what had transpired since the closure. Thank you. Next slide. Okay, so in terms of the methods, just very briefly, because I'm sure you don't may not be too interested in the intense details of the methods, but for the first study objective, what we did was we compiled a database of both open and closed schools in Ontario dating back to 2011. And so to get the closed school data, we had to submit a Freedom of Information request to the Ministry of Education. And essentially, we just needed the names and the street addresses of the closed school sites. We also asked for information about the school board and the language used at the school. Open school data was readily available is publicly available for download from the Ministry of Education website. So we included the open school data in our database as well. The second objective, which was focused on the processes, the people accommodation review processes, involved key informant interviews from our 2 districts. And then the third objective involved administering online surveys to households that were located within the communities where schools had closed, as well as interviews with residents who had completed the surveys and expressed interest in talking more about the school closure issue. And then the fourth objective is this interactive webinar today, followed by a deliberative workshop to really take what we hear today and have more detailed discussions with some selected individuals towards the end of the month. Next slide, please. Great. Okay, so I'm just going to jump right in with some of our key findings. I'll also just mention, I just reviewed again the details, the document that we sent in advance of the meeting, and I know that there's a number of other publications that have come out of this project that have been spin-offs or other colleagues who've written on this topic, and I can't cover it all. We just don't have enough time, so I just want to give you really a few key insights from selected publications that we've written. So in the first objective, try and understand the characteristics of communities where schools closed. Very quickly, what we've learned is that over that 10-year span, 404 publicly funded schools had closed in Ontario. And indeed, school closures happened disproportionately in small to mid-sized cities, as well as in rural communities. Closures were also more common in more materially and socially deprived communities. And we did do some population change analyses and found no evidence of significantly declining child populations prior to school closures in the communities where schools closed when we conducted our analyses at the dissemination area level. Next slide, please. In terms of understanding what has become of the sites where schools have closed, this slide essentially provides the key findings. So about 61% of closed school properties have been repurposed as of 2022. What we found was that educational reuses were more common in large metropolitan centers, whereas commercial reuses were more common in rural communities. We also found that of the properties that had been reused, about 16% would serve populations that might be experiencing high levels of deprivation, whereas about 44% are serving populations that we might consider more affluent or experiencing low levels of deprivation. About 39%, almost 40% of properties still remain vacant today. And so quite a number of these properties have been vacant for over 5 years. What we also learned from this analysis is that school boards retained ownership more often in metropolitan centers, whereas private ownership of the closed school property was more common in small to mid-sized communities and rural communities. Next slide. Okay, so moving on to the second objective, which related to the dynamics and shortcomings of pupil accommodation review processes. We conducted interviews with 30 key informants across the 2 districts. And these interviewees were a diverse group. It was a combination of former school board trustees and staff, municipal councillors and staff, some current and former, as well as a range of different kinds of school advocates, which may have been parents or really engaged residents in the community, retired school staff, local business representatives, things like that, people like that. In terms of the questions that guided the interviews, we asked a series of different kinds of questions, but generally speaking, they touched on the following. So what their perspective was on how the PAR process unfolded for a specific school, and the interviews generally focused on the school in a particular community that closed. Sometimes we talked about multiple school closures. What concerns they heard from residents prior to the closure, how do they think the closure has impacted the community, and what changes do they feel are necessary to the decision-making process after the moratorium is lifted? We analyzed the key informant interview transcripts using the OECD framework for trust in public institutions, because as we were reviewing the transcripts, we discovered that this was really the overarching theme in these interviews. It boiled down very much to trust. And so within this framework, there are these different domains that we studied the interview findings within those contexts. Next slide, please. So in terms of the first domain of responsiveness, the emergent finding here was that our key informants felt that there was a lack of coordination between school boards and municipalities. So as articulated by one municipal staff member that we interviewed, we're trying to coordinate where growth is occurring in a place, and it seems that there's been a disconnect between where growth occurs and where school boards decide to build a school. In terms of reliability, some interviewees questioned the parameters that were being used to evaluate schools that were under review. So one school advocate said, our school and town name, Watson, reported as having a facility condition index of X. The government inspection said it was Y, and the Amoresco puts it at Z. This pattern continues throughout every school and township. How can this pattern be explained? These variations should have merited further investigation. In terms of harmony, many of the interviewees spoke about the friction that the pupil accommodation review meetings created between communities. And as articulated by one former trustee, it basically tore the heart out of the community and put them into a fight that went on too long, pitted neighbor against neighbor, community against community. It was a gruesome time. Next slide, please. So the next theme we examined related to openness. And what we heard in this context was that the design of public meetings often didn't reflect the purpose of engaging community stakeholders. So one school advocate explained, I think it was very prescribed process, very predetermined. Things were laid out in such a way as to draw only one conclusion. Trustees were discouraged publicly from speaking with members of the community. You go to the meetings and you listen. So in that sense, it wasn't an open process. In terms of integrity, we heard that the power structure within the school board and the way decisions were made was compromised. And so this school advocate explained, the balance of power should be that the director serves at the pleasure of the board, and currently it's that the board serves at the pleasure of the director. So whatever the director or senior staff, whatever their wishes are, they control the agenda at that board meeting. When trustees hear something from a public source and they think, you know what, that has validity, we should really consider this, whether it hits the agenda or not is driven by very few people. And the final theme we investigated related to fairness. And this has already been raised, I think, by Jen, this idea that a system-wide approach taken by school boards fails to recognize the uniqueness of communities. So this trustee just articulated that we have a provincial policy that doesn't recognize uniqueness of all of our communities, and we have a one-size-fits-all approach that doesn't achieve success for either type of community, whether urban or rural. Next slide, please. Okay, so the next objective of our study was to speak to residents and hear from their perspectives how the school closure has, what kinds of consequences have arisen because of the closure of the school in their community. So the previous objective was talking to key informants, so people who are really involved, and they may have been trustees or municipal staff, school board staff, and people who are really engaged in advocacy, whereas these were just residents and community. So we administered a survey to capture their perspective on their agreement with various statements about the impacts of school closures on students, as well as on the wider community. So with respect to students, we found that the majority of residents who responded to the survey felt that students would become more reliant on cars and school buses to get to and from school. They'd be away from home for longer periods of time, and then we would receive less attention in larger classes. In terms of perspectives on the impacts on the wider community, we heard that the majority of respondents identified that the closure had made residents angry, and there's resentment in the community, and this was especially acute among rural residents. They also noted that there's fewer children in the community during the day and fewer opportunities for parents to socialize, so sort of speaking to diminished community vitality and vibrancy. And then you can also see that rural residents were also much more likely to identify this issue of fewer families moving into the community. So there's less of a draw for their community. Next slide, please. So we also engaged in some thematic analysis of our resident interview transcripts, and we identified some key themes that emerged. So first was related to commute times, that children are spending the longer periods of time on the bus to get to school. The next theme related to reduced vibrancy in the community. So this person was sort of speaking to how much more vibrant the community used to be when there was a school there. And then community connection. So this particular parent sort of spoke to the fact that children and residents don't know each other as well anymore because the children that come to the school aren't residents of the community. Next slide, please. So then the next theme that we explored in the context of the resident interviews really related to the fight against closures and the work that residents engaged in to try and resist the closure. So first, we learned about how politically engaged residents had become, working with different members of parliament, sending out newsletters, and just keeping engaged throughout the process. We also learned that residents did their due diligence. They really explored different angles to make the case for why the school should be kept open, from a heritage angle, from an economics angle, from many perspectives to try and present what they felt were viable alternatives to closure. And we also learned about the fact that residents did have a broader impact. So while they may not have been able to prevent the closure of the school in their community, their voices were heard at the provincial level, and they felt that they were part of the reason why the ministry had decided to institute the moratorium in the first place. Next slide, please. Okay, we also wanted to explore their level of satisfaction or dissatisfaction with the decision-making process, as well as the final decision, and the ways in which trust may have been impacted by the PAR process. So as you can see, dissatisfaction with both the process and the final decision was pretty universal in the 4 communities that we studied. If you look at the scale of the figure on the left, it starts at 90% or higher dissatisfaction. You can also see how trust changed or had been compromised as a result of the pupil accommodation review process and the final decision. Some stakeholders took a bigger hit in terms of reduced trust. So the Ministry of Education took the biggest hit. Board trustees were also took a hit in terms of the level of trust that residents had, and decreased trust was more acute among rural residents compared to urban. Next slide, please. So the final theme that we explored with the resident interviews related to the connection between the pupil accommodation review processes and the closure decisions that were made. So questionable logic was raised as one concern from a parent, and I'll read this quote. It was a school with a capacity for 800 students, and it had less than 400 students. So that meant it needed to be closed. But that was an unfair measurement. There was no empty space in the school. All the square footage of the school was accounted for, and the school board wasn't losing money. Like they were collecting rent for the space that didn't have students. The math was bad. Another issue that was raised was the sense that some communities are just being targeted for closures, regardless of what kind of case is being made to try and resist them. So this one quote that emerged, I would venture to say that many of these decisions and decisions like this are an injustice that's inflicted on a community, communities that can't fight for themselves for whatever reasons. It could be economically stressed or socially stressed because they're easy targets. So this idea that regardless of what kind of case is made, certain communities just seem to be in the crosshairs of the school board, and that's the perception that was articulated by these residents. And then the final thing that we heard really speaks to disillusionment with the whole process, and I think that also helps us to understand the decline in trust. And so one parent explained it was exhausting, but it felt like no matter, even if we put together the golden egg solution, it didn't seem to matter, and it all fell on deaf ears, which was so frustrating. Next slide, please. So I'm going to just try and synthesize what you've just heard so that it's kind of fresh in your mind before we go into our breakout groups. So from our first objective, which was try to understand the characteristics of communities where schools closed and the scope of closures in Ontario, what we learned was that closures happened predominantly in small to mid-sized CMAs in rural areas and in more deprived communities, and seemingly in the absence of child population decline at the community level. Nearly 40% of closed schools remain vacant at this time, and sites repurposed for education are more likely to be in metropolitan centers. Fewer than 1/5 of sites seem to serve populations that would be socially or materially deprived. For our second objective, we were focused on the processes and the dynamics and shortcomings of the school, of the decision-making process. And what we learned was that the ways in which closure decisions were made has compromised trust in institutions. We heard in terms of key themes from our key informants that there's a perceived lack of coordination between boards and municipalities, questionable metrics have been used to inform decisions, communities were pitted against each other in public meetings, which also seem to lack some transparency, and finally that this one-size-fits-all approach to school asset management doesn't recognize the uniqueness of communities. Next slide, please. In terms of our third objective, we learned from residents that only a small minority could recognize or could acknowledge that there were benefits from the closures, such as access to modern facilities and better programming for students, whereas the vast majority identified a number of costs, including increased reliance on automobiles, high levels of resident anger, and decreased community vibrancy. We also learned that residents were very engaged and fought hard to avoid closure, including outreach with politicians at various levels, and really did their homework in terms of background research to present what they felt were viable alternatives. We also learned that there's widespread dissatisfaction and decline in trust in various stakeholders that's fed by perceptions by these by residents that decisions had already been made and that certain communities were simply targets for closures. Next slide, please. So what now? Well, we're all here together to collaborate and work together and hopefully not fall to our demise, but actually to contribute to something really magical and beautiful. And really what we want to do is collectively interpret the implications of these processes and consequences so that we can think of what an improved decision-making model might look like. So I really want to draw on your insights, your perspectives, based on the work that you do in your communities. We also recognize that the fiscal pressures facing Ontario school boards have not gone away, and many boards are sounding the alarm bell and putting pressure on the province to lift the moratorium to relieve these pressures. So this issue is not going away, even though the research has been going on since 2018. This is still a very relevant issue today. So for the next hour, what I'm hoping we can do is answer this question, given what you already knew coming into this meeting, because you all know a lot about this already. as well as what you've learned from our project on the scope, processes, and consequences of closures in Ontario. How can this decision-making model be amended in a way that would maximize benefits to communities and minimize harm? And I think that's my last slide, Regan.
Thanks very much, Patricia. That was a great overview of a lot of research that's happened that I encourage people to reflect upon as we proceed with small group discussion. So, folks, we're going to break you momentarily into small groups of approximately 8 people to provide you with a chance to reflect on your perspectives and reflect on the research to specifically answer this question that's in front of you. Drawing upon your personal knowledge and the research findings, what should be the key inputs to inform decisions about school closures? So again, your personal knowledge, the research findings, what should be the key inputs to inform decisions about school closures? So we're going to provide a little bit more of an instruction related to that. So as mentioned, you'll be placed into small groups of 7 to 8 people to discuss the question I just reviewed. You might want to take a picture of this just to make sure you've got if you've got your camera handy, take a picture of it just to make sure you've got these instructions as you step into your small groups. I'll also mention, in case I forget, that while these sessions to this point in time have been recorded, you won't be recorded by electronic means in the small group discussion. So that's private to yourselves in that discussion group. Within that small group, take a couple of moments to introduce yourselves and identify one person in the group to serve as facilitator. So we're asking for someone ideally to volunteer, but if you have to nominate someone, that's okay too. And the role of that person is simply to keep the discussion on topic and identify some key points that you'll put into Slido to report back. So we won't ask that person who serves as facilitator. We won't put them on the spot when they come back and ask them to report back. They just have to, within that group, keep things on topic.